We're turning this week to a spiritual discipline that, at its heart, is a communal discipline. Uh, it's a discipline that relates to the entire Christian community and begins with the way in which we receive one another. So it's an important discipline for pastors to begin to reflect on in a serious way, both how they receive and how they are received, how they accept hospitality. We're going to do this in a couple of different stages. We're going to talk about particularly what a Lucan spirituality of hospitality looks like. We're going to talk about the way in which Christians have traditionally extended hospitality. Uh, and it's important to understand exactly what's wrong with the images of hospitality in the wider culture. How is it that the Christian understanding of this spiritual discipline is extremely different than the wider culture? That's nowhere more evident than in Christian worship. So we're going to talk about worship as hospitality, um, preparing you for the exercise of the week in class, where we're actually going to write a liturgy around the discipline of hospitality. And then we're going to close with a couple of different exercises, one of which is Lectio Divina on Psalm 23, and then a Lectio Audire um, around a hymn. Um, Hospitality is at the heart of how the early Christian community understood itself, and that's largely because hospitality in the ancient world was extremely important. Hospitality in the ancient world um, was a way in which individuals or the community would welcome strangers. Even the word uh, xenia in the ancient world talks about a kind of guest friendship or ritualized friendship. Um, Hospitality is a way in which you received individuals into your home by promising them provisions and protection. The idea, of course, is that you're neutralizing any potential threats for travelers. Um, in the ancient world, traveling carried with it extreme risks. You were subject to being robbed, you were subject to being raped, and this notion of neutralizing that threat is at the heart of the Genesis narrative with Lot and the strangers who come knocking on the door asking for the young women and the young men in the home. At its heart in the ancient world, hospitality was a form of ritualized friendship. It was a way that you extended protection and provision to those who would be traveling. And this isn't necessarily, people you knew. This could be strangers. Um, and so the idea was that you would provide for travelers things that would be necessary in order for them to sustain themselves on their travels, both by protection and by provision. It's not a surprise then that, at least in the New Testament, the early Christian community understood hospitality to be a way of expressing love for God and for neighbor. There are three key texts in the Lucan tradition around hospitality. And they all, I mean, you think about the parable of the Good Samaritan, for example. The guy who finds a traveler in a ditch, in the road, who has been abandoned by every social power there is, a number of religious authorities, a number of even political authorities have walked by on the other side of the street. And it is a Samaritan who, among the worst of the worst in the eyes of conservative Jews in the ancient world, it's the Samaritan that extends hospitality. It's the Samaritan that takes up this individual who has been beaten by robbers, who has had himself stripped of all of his provisions, who has had himself stripped even of his personal safety. This guy just left for dead in the ditch, and the Good Samaritan is the one who picks him up, takes him to an inn, pays the innkeeper for the person's stay and for the person's care in order to bring them back to health and provide for them as they would begin the journey again. It's this parable that is at the heart of how both Jesus understands hospitality and how the early, particularly Lucan community understood hospitality. And that was, hospitality is a way of acting out the gospel and unifying the community of faith, regardless of just how much an outsider they might otherwise be. Hospitality becomes a way for the church to say, this is how we care for literal fellow pilgrims, and this is how we express God's love toward them, and how we express our love toward them, how we express our love for God by seeing the image of God in this person. So for the early Christian community, particularly in the New Testament, hospitality is one of, if not the central feature of evangelism. It is the way in which the Christian community acts out the gospel. And that means that these early Christians are learning not just how to extend grace and extend hospitality as hosts, but also as guests. I mean, you think, for example, of Paul's travels and how he's received into various and sundry households that he talks about in his letters. Hospitality has to do not only with extending that grace of the gospel toward others, but receiving it as we walk in the world as well. And what this does, what hospitality does for the Christian community, is it creates an interdependency of relationships between disciples and other disciples and disciples in the Lord. So by the time you get to the Didache, hospitality is understood to be one of, if not the spiritual practice for the Christian community. And it's centralized around the table. It's centralized around the Eucharist. For the early Christian community, the way in which we receive strangers is literally an acting out of the gospel. Much of Jesus' life is tied to the giving and receiving of hospitality. So by the time you get to Paul's letters, hospitality is a central feature of the Christian community. It's no accident that, at least in terms of how the earliest Christian community gathered for worship, was in homes. Hospitality was a way of acting out worship. And that worship takes place in the homes of the faithful. There are a variety of examples of how this works its way out in the early Christian community. Aristides, in his Apology in the 2nd century, they love one another. And from widows, they do not turn away their esteem. Now, widows in the ancient world were some of the least powerful people in terms of social power. And to describe the early Christian community as not turning away from the widows is to say the very people who are the most vulnerable in society. These are the ones that they care for. This is how they love one another. They deliver the orphan from him who treats him harshly. And he who has gives to him who has not, without boasting. When they see a stranger, they take him into their homes and they rejoice over him as a very brother. For they do not call them brethren after the flesh, but brethren after the Spirit and in God. This understanding, at least by the 2nd century, is that the Christian community is willing to extend open arms toward the most vulnerable in society and providing for them and protecting them from the very people who would abuse and neglect them. This is practiced to such an extent that by the 4th century, early Christians are developing the first hospitals. This particularly happens in Asia Minor. By the 4th century, there's a description of St. Basil's Hospital in Caesarea as a new city. This hospital is so large and cares for so many. It is a storehouse of piety. Early Christians extended hospitality to such an extent that the protection and provision is provided for the sick, the neglected, the vulnerable, the outcasts. That puts hospitality as a practice for the Christian community at its very core. This is who they are. Now, while it's a communal activity, it still remained a very personal and a very individual responsibility. It is the case that the community is responsible for hospitality, and that's fundamentally exercised in the Eucharist. But that's where Christians are to learn it, so that in their daily lives, this is the same kind of spiritual practice that they extend toward their neighbors, and even toward those for whom there's no reciprocity. There's nothing they can get back. Chrysostom's homily on Acts and homily on First Timothy, there are two texts in which Chrysostom says that while it is the case the Christian community exercises hospitality towards those who cannot care for themselves, cannot provide for themselves, cannot protect themselves, while it is the case that that is the Christian community's responsibility, the community designates individuals who have this spiritual gift to exercise this discipline. It occurs not only among the religious, not only among the growing monastics, but also among everyday ordinary Christians. This is a spiritual practice for everybody. And while it is the case that monastic communities, particularly by the third, fourth century, are demonstrating this hospitality in the way in which they designate certain roles for the monks. It is the case that they viewed what they were doing as a model for the wider Christian community. St. Benedict's rule, when it establishes those roles, the guest master, the gatekeeper, the cellarer, the guy who takes care of the food, the guy who takes care of the actual rooms in which individuals will sleep, the cells, designating certain individuals for those tasks is an understanding that the monastic community has, that this is such a deep calling for the Christian community, that we need individuals for whom this is what they do. And for the monastics, this is a training for those who would be received by us as our guests to then go out and act this way in their homes, in their churches. So for the monastic tradition, hospitality was never about, well, this is what we're supposed to do and we're religious, so this is us. No, it becomes a school of hospitality. The earliest Christian communities understood that hospitality as a spiritual tradition is at the very heart of who we are as Christians. Even the modern institutions that we have, for example, public hospitals. Well, public hospitals arose because the medieval hospitals that were connected to religious communities, to monks and nuns, those come under the influence of the modern nation states that begin developing in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries. So out of this Christian understanding of hospitality writ large for the wider community, extended by the Christian community, once those organizations, once those institutions become public and come under certain municipal control, they're still practiced as a Christian discipline. It's only with the Reformation that there is a shift from that very Christian understanding toward something else. And that is because of the Renaissance. This developing notion of human rights in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, 14th century, this understanding that everybody deserves a level of care. Everybody deserves a level of right to medical care, to protection. So once these Christian institutions come under the control of localized political institutions, that is the nation state, and then they see this shift in motivation in the Renaissance and Reformation, we rarely understand what happens in a hospital now as hospitality. In fact, we now have a whole industry around hospitality. Hotels, you know, vacation clubs. Uh, but the idea has always been providing for the protection and provision of a traveler. Now, the motivation is different, but that is at its heart what hospitality is. So what we need to do is to begin to reflect on how can we reclaim our practices of hospitality as overtly Christian. We are individuals, we are persons who offer welcome, and that welcome is to be life-giving. That is the heart of Christian hospitality. Well, this is going to call for a lot of discernment, a lot of flexibility, a lot of humility, a lot of generosity, because the mindset that the Christian community has now is, well, this is the responsibility of the nation state. Healthcare is the responsibility of the country, right? I will be honest with you. If local Christian communities became serious about how we extend this care and provision for the least, the lost, the neglected, a lot of what we know as poor medical care disappears. Some years ago, I was involved with a number of pastors who got together and developed a concept of communal care that would provide medical care for those who had no insurance and no way of affording the kind of care that they needed. So churches would pool the money and fund this clinic. Doctors would volunteer their services. Uh, Doctors would obtain the supplies that would be necessary. The church would underwrite the cost of those supplies. And over time, this medical facility began to extend care toward a region that had access to poor access to medical care. And eventually they developed a sliding scale. You know, if you could afford X, then you'd chip in a little money so that it wouldn't, cost too much for the churches. But still, the idea was no matter what the cost, no matter what the no matter what needed to be done, the church would step up and would extend that kind of hospitality. So within the congregations, there developed this social ministry for medical care for the community. And it required a kind of adaptability, a kind of flexibility for those congregations to begin to think, how can we do this? In another congregation, we began a program where couples would be trained in how, in teaching, parenting, in mentoring families toward health, couples who were in crisis. And that kind of social ministry began to provide social support systems for families that had nearly no chance of survival without them. It just took some creativity. In order for churches to begin to recapture the heart of hospitality, it's going to require a great degree of flexibility, a great degree of discernment, what is needed within the community, how can the church work together to provide that kind of care, how can we protect those who are the most vulnerable. And it will be a sacrifice. It will inevitably require a great degree of generosity on behalf of the congregations, a great degree of generosity on behalf of the families. But that's who we are. It's not about reciprocity, remember. It's about providing for those who are the most vulnerable and protecting them. And connecting that to the way in which the Christian community understands the gospel, the way in which we understand how it was that Jesus lived his own life. This is going to require that we become critical of how we have surrendered as Christians hospitality to other outside forces that have motivations unconnected to our own. Typically, this is because we have, as a wider church, adopted and adapted to the images that pervade around what hospitality is. Hospitality is, to quote Henry Nouwen, in our culture, tea parties, bland conversation, and a general atmosphere of coziness. If you walk up to the average woman in a Christian congregation and you ask them, what is hospitality? They're going to point to something like Southern living, where hospitality becomes reduced to nothing more than private entertainment. And it's nearly always extended to people who are more or less like ourselves in terms of class and status. This very warped image of hospitality, I'm convinced, is based on a warped image of God. God's a very nice guy who only wants us to be nice too. And so hospitality is really nothing more than a way of being nice toward those who are quite directly in our circle of influence. That is, the people who are just like us. God's a nice guy, and God wants us to be nice too. That is not Christian hospitality. Christian hospitality is not a form of generic friendship. Jim McClendon, in his book on ethics, says that we have allowed the wider culture to hijack the house practices depicted in the New Testament texts. Those house practices, or what in German are called Haustafeln, those Haustafeln or house rules are the very quick lists of things that you should and should not do as a Christian community. For example, Romans 12. Romans 12 is a Haustafeln. It is a list of house rules. That's how the church is supposed to live its hospitality. Romans 12. You want to know what hospitality looks like in the Christian community? Romans 12. There are other Haustafeln in the New Testament, but that's the clearest example. That's the one that's the most accessible. It's the one that's the most known. We've allowed the wider culture to hijack those texts, those practices from us, and instead create a hospitality industry where time is defined by consumption. I want you to think about that for a second. How do you measure time? What is time? What is a theology of time? Well, for most people, time is really nothing more than a discrete unit of temporal measurement. That is, something you can quantify in order to work. 40 hours a week. If that's what time is for you, if time is nothing more than a quantifiable measurement for economic purposes, that is not a Christian understanding of time. A Christian understanding of time is the way in which we relate to one another. So let me ask you, what's a vacation experience? Well, for most people, a vacation experience is a week or a few days that you mark off in your calendar where you run off to Disney World and you do all the things in Disney World, which, by the way, have absolutely no connection to your larger life or the things that really matter to you, your family, your friends, your church community. There's no connection. It's just a measurement of time where you run off and you do something fun. It is literally, and I want you to hear this, vacating your life. Running off and leaving it. And that's what the hospitality industry is. Running off from your life. How is that hospitality? What is it that we do with our time? Is it the drudgery of measuring off moments spent doing X, Y, or Z away from the people who really matter to us? Or is time a way of measuring relationships? I work not so I can get a paycheck, not so I can spend time out of the home and do X, Y, or Z. I work because of my wife. She matters. Therefore, in order to care, in order to provide, in order to protect, I work. Well, what about your vacation? It has nothing to do with how long I'm gone. What I'm trying to get you to do is to begin to think more seriously about how can we take hospitality as a Christian discipline, as a spiritual activity seriously, so that it begins to impact even the way in which we understand things like time, relationships. Christian hospitality is a very public way of life. And this has been clearly true from the stories of the martyrs. I think, for example, the story of Perpetua, who was put to death because of the way in which she understood caring for children. She would not surrender her faith in front of her children. So they killed her. Why would she not do it? Well, it wasn't because she was selfish. It was because the protection and provision necessary to raise up her children as Christians. The way in which we publicly act out this care for, this provision for, this protection of the vulnerable is a public way of life for Christians, and it is dramatically different in its motivations and in its understanding than the wider culture's understanding of hospitality. Nowhere is this clearer than in the liturgy. How do we spend our time in the liturgy? Well, it's not marked off by an hour on Sunday morning. It is literally serving God. Christian hospitality, as exercised in worship, serves God, not the market. So the practices like the church year, the daily calendar, the practice of Sabbath keeping, all of those are intimately related to the way in which Christians practice hospitality. In the liturgy, God gathers us, God speaks to us, and God feeds us. God pulls us in out of the world and offers us protection. God pulls us in out of the world and offers us provision. The liturgy is God's hospitality extended toward us. And worship has always been about us being pulled into that divine life where Christ gives of himself to the Father. And when he does that, he opens up the way for us to be filled with the divine life. In the liturgy, God is our host. But I want you to hear me. That does not domesticate God. The liturgy is a, a an experience of encountering the divine, which is at once both comforting and challenging. Sometimes, as Moses learned, it is a terror to be encountered by God. The liturgy will change you. And in changing you, it creates a hospitable people of whom you are one. The hospitality that God extends creates us as a church. A people with a brand new purpose, a brand new story, and a brand new life together. Commenced in baptism and sustained in Eucharist. The life of the Christian community and the hospitality created by it is not something we do. God gathers us, God speaks to us, God feeds us, and then God sends us. So the unity created by hospitality is not our own doing. If you think you can foster unity by what you do, you will doom it to failure. This is God's act, first, foremost, and only, in that it transforms us. And so we become co-laborers, actors together with God. The liturgy is the place where the church learns how hospitable God actually is toward us, and how enabled we are then to be hospitable towards others. I want you to take a good, close, meditative look at Psalm 23. I know we could probably all recite it. Most of us know it because we've read it at funerals time and time again. Take your time to listen to God in this text. What do you hear God say about hospitality? I want you to pause the video and I want you to practice Lectio with this text. Now I want to turn to a hymn. There are a variety of resources if you want to explore hospitality with more depth. I really can't recommend Christine Poole's Making Room too highly. Um, it is, in my estimation, the fundamental text to understand what Christian hospitality looks like, and with very practical advice for communities who want to begin to practice this discipline uh, more effectively and more faithfully. There are some others listed there. Um, the the Soul Care in the African American Practice has a great chapter on it, but it really is just a chapter of treatment. Uh, there are two texts by Amy Oden, which are really great to look at as well. You're probably going to have some questions, some comments, some concerns when we gather together. Be sure to bring your Lectio notes based on Psalm 23 and on the hymn when we come together. So bring your questions when we gather.